Hey, so I was asked about how codependency works with boundaries, and realistically, this probably should be two videos, but we'll see how far that we can get. So it's important to recognize that codependency um, revolves around dysfunctional relationship patterns, right? And so a lot of times it's a clinginess, it's a manipulation, and that ultimately there's a rescuing that has to take place, right? There's caretaking, there's denial, there is wanting to enable. There's a lot of those different parts, and ultimately there's the idea that this person is trying to take care of someone. They are trying to make sure that they feel loved, that they feel secure. But what's realistically happening is that they are projecting their internal insecurities onto someone else, right? Which is a problem because you're not really trying to help me. You're trying to help yourself by helping me. And that means that you have a savior complex of some sort, right? Like it's a projection of yourself. And that's not fair to the people in your life, right? And so navigating through codependency with boundaries is going to be difficult because it requires work on both people, on both sides of that spectrum, to navigate it. So for the individual who is struggling with codependency, they're going to have to, number one, realize that they have a codependency issue, and number two, that they are willing to work on it. And in that can come things like awareness and accountability, and ultimately them taking the practical steps that's necessary for them to heal that wound that they have. On the flip side of this, the person that has to establish a hard boundary of, hey, I know you love me, but you're crossing a line. That's when some of the other discussions that we had so far, part one and part two, about boundaries will kick back in. Because at that point, you can still work toward holding that, but there has to be a conversation that happens first about the nature of the relationship and the nature of what's going on before you can really establish that. So it's difficult because when it comes to codependency, it exists on every relationship stage, right? It exists with spouse, parent, child, child to their parent, right? Relationships in both platonic and romantic relationships where ultimately they're crossing the line because their codependency is causing them to have this rescuer position that they're holding. And so being able to navigate it and navigate that space for the individual will help set up a better guideline for the person who was trying to hold the boundary to do so. I hope that makes sense. It's very complicated, but ultimately, the person with codependency has to heal, has to realize there's a wound, and has to want to fix it. Give permission to the person who is trying to have the boundaries to check them, while the person who needs to have the boundary is holding their boundary line. Right? So ultimately, there needs to be wound heal first for the codependent person, and they have to heal before boundaries can become a real conversation. It will then be up to the person who is trying to establish boundaries to determine whether or not they can stay, whether or not they can be patient with the person while they work through their healing, and also being that accountability person for that, for them, and being able to put it back in front of them like, hey, you're doing XYZ again, and we said that we were going to work on this, so this is my reminder to you. And that takes a lot of work on the other person, but that's going to be between the two people. Ultimately, the truth still remains is that you have to set a boundary for yourself, because it's a breeding ground for toxic relationships, and it's not going to be an easy trek. And this conversation is probably needing to be more than just 4 minutes in this video, but it's very sticky territory. And so I hope that the little information that I was able to share just now helps someone. Ultimately, again, they have to heal. They have to heal, and you have to hold your boundary. And that may result in some loss, but the more conversations that we have with people who we're trying to establish boundaries with, and the more that they want to heal, the smaller the margin for difficulty and conflict. It takes both parties wanting to work on it for it to heal. But heal and then have boundaries. Hold that line still, even if they're working on themselves, and you'll find the best possible outcome to happen from that. Hope it helped.